Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, sacred, and absolutely unforgiving. The biblical world as it truly was. Not the Sunday school version you grew up with. The raw, gritty truth that Hollywood documentaries never show you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this spiritual journey. Now, turn off all the lights. The screen will also dim in a moment to help you relax as you listen to tonight's story. Let's ease into our biblical journey together. Now you're in ancient Judea, around 30 CE. The harsh landscape surrounds you, not in paintings or movies, but in smell, sound, and touch. The good news: you're here, witnessing biblical history in the making. The bad news: you probably won't survive until sunset. The air around you thick with dust, smoke from cooking fires, and the unmistakable scent of too many people living without modern plumbing. Your bed isn't memory foam, it's just a thin mat on hard, packed dirt. No pillows, no sheets, just rough, woven fabric that scratches against your skin like sandpaper with a grudge. The sounds aren't gentle birdsong or your phone notifications. It's donkeys braying, merchants already shouting, children crying, and a dozen languages mixing in the streets. This isn't a Bible story anymore. This is survival, and you're already failing at it. The morning light isn't filtered through curtains, but strikes your eyes with merciless intensity as it streams through the narrow window of your mud, brick dwelling. The walls around you aren't smooth drywall painted in calming colors from a designer palette. They're uneven, rough, textured clay mixed with straw, cracked in places, showing the wear of seasons and years. Your fingers brush against them, feeling every imperfection, every bump and ridge that tells the story of hands that shaped this shelter long before you arrived. Your feet touch the floor, not carpet, not hardwood, not even tile, just packed earth, cold despite the growing heat outside, sending a shock through your system that jolts you fully into this ancient reality. The floor is swept but still dusty. In the biblical world, dust is less a nuisance and more a constant companion, an inescapable presence that works its way into everything: your food, your clothes, your lungs. Outside, Jerusalem, or perhaps a smaller village, comes to life. The narrow streets weren't designed by urban planners with traffic flow in mind. They evolved organically, creating a maze of pathways barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably. These streets serve as extensions of homes, marketplaces, and social spaces all at once. Children dart between adults carrying heavy water jars and baskets of produce. Chickens peck at scattered grain, unbothered by the human chaos surrounding them. The smells hit you in waves, some pleasant, others decidedly not. The aroma of fresh bread baking in communal ovens mingles with the pungent odor of animal dung used for fuel. Spices being ground at a nearby stall send notes of cinnamon, cumin, and coriander dancing through the air, momentarily masking the underlying scent of unwashed bodies and open sewage channels running along the street edges. Your stomach growls, reminding you that breakfast isn't waiting in the refrigerator. There are no refrigerators, no freezers, no preservatives or sealed packaging. Food spoils quickly in this climate. What you eat today was either harvested yesterday or preserved through drying, salting, or fermentation. Nothing is wasted because nothing can afford to be wasted. The biblical world operates on a knife's edge of survival that modern minds can barely comprehend. One bad harvest, one infected wound, one contaminated water source could spell disaster, not just for individuals but entire communities. The margin for error is non-existent. Your clothing feels strange against your skin. No synthetic fibers, no elastic waistbands, no machine-stitched seams. Just wool that itches with every movement and linen that, while cooler, still lacks the comfort of modern fabrics. The garments aren't tailored to your body but hang loosely, designed for function rather than fashion. There are no buttons, no zippers, just cords and the occasional metal clasp for those who can afford such luxuries. Your throat feels dry, and the thought of water becomes consuming. But water isn't as simple as turning a tap. The nearest well is a communal gathering place at the village center, and drawing water means physical labor, hauling heavy clay jars back to your dwelling. And that water, it's not filtered, not treated, not guaranteed safe by any health department. It might carry parasites or bacteria that your modern immune system has never encountered. Welcome to the biblical world, where every day is a victory against forces continually working to end your existence. As you step outside your dwelling, the brilliant Mediterranean sun assaults your eyes. No sunglasses, no brimmed caps with UV protection. Just your hand raised to shield your vision until your pupils can adjust to the glare bouncing off limestone buildings and dusty pathways. The heat isn't moderated by air conditioning or electric fans. It's an oppressive presence, a weight pressing down on your shoulders, drawing moisture from your body faster than you can replenish it. People move with purpose around you. There's no concept of leisure time as we understand it today. Even rest is purposeful, a necessary recharging so work can continue. Children as young as 4 or 5 carry water, tend to younger siblings, or help with simple tasks. The elderly, if they've survived long enough to earn that title, don't retire but transition to less physically demanding roles. Teaching, craft work, minding the very young. The sounds of labor surround you, the rhythmic pounding of a carpenter's hammer, the scrape of millstones grinding wheat into flour, the clatter of looms weaving thread into fabric. These aren't hobbies or artisanal pursuits. They're the essential activities that keep everyone clothed, fed, and sheltered. Your modern sensibilities are immediately challenged by the proximity of animals. They aren't kept in distant farms or seen only in petting zoos. They're integrated into daily life, chickens underfoot, donkeys loaded with goods, sheep being driven through streets to pasture. Their sounds, smells, and waste are part of the sensory landscape that no biblical person would find remarkable. The goat that eyes you suspiciously from a nearby pen isn't a cute farm animal. It's wealth, food, milk, and eventually material for clothing and tools. Its value isn't sentimental, but intensely practical. Every part will be used when the time comes, from horns to hooves. You notice a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, carrying a heavy water jar that must be at least a quarter of her body weight. Her arms strain with the effort, but there's no complaint, no adult rushing to help. This is normal. This is expected. Children aren't sheltered from labor, but incorporated into it as soon as they're capable. Their contributions aren't optional, but necessary for family survival. The marketplace ahead buzzes with activity as vendors arrange their goods, small piles of vegetables, strings of dried fish, stacks of flatbread. No barcodes, no fixed prices, no sales tax calculated automatically. Every transaction is a negotiation, a dance of offer and counter, offer conducted with animation and strategic displays of offense or indignation. You pass a woman grinding grain between 2 heavy stones. The motion is practiced, efficient, but you can see the strain in her shoulders, the calluses on her hands. This isn't a 10-minute kitchen prep activity. This is hours of physical labor to produce enough flour for her family's daily bread. No grocery stores with pre-ground options. No bread machines mixing and kneading automatically. Just muscle, time, and necessity. Near the village edge, you spot men working a field with primitive plows drawn by oxen. The soil is rocky, stubborn, reluctant to yield to human demands. Farming isn't a romantic connection with nature, but a constant battle against it, against drought, pests, disease, and the fundamental limitations of technology that requires 10 people to accomplish what one modern farmer with machinery could do in a fraction of the time. A sudden commotion draws your attention. Someone is sick, very sick. There are no hospitals to call, no ambulances to summon, no trained paramedics with modern equipment. There's only family, neighbors, perhaps a local healer with limited knowledge and even more limited resources. Sickness in the biblical world isn't an inconvenience, but a potential death sentence. Without antibiotics, without sterilized surgical tools, without even a basic understanding of germ theory, infections that modern medicine routinely cures will here claim lives with terrifying efficiency. You notice things missing from this landscape that your brain keeps expecting to find. No power lines stretching between buildings, no street signs marking intersections, no glass windows reflecting sunlight, no brick chimneys releasing smoke in controlled columns. The architecture is functional but limited by available materials and techniques: stone, mud brick, rough-hewn timber, thatch. Buildings rarely rise above 2 stories, and those that do represent significant wealth and engineering skill. As midday approaches, the heat intensifies. There's no escape into air-conditioned spaces, no refrigerated drinks to provide relief. Work slows by necessity. People retreat to shade where possible. The very rhythm of life bends to accommodate environmental realities that can't be overcome with technology. You're thirsty again, perpetually thirsty in this climate. The water jug passed to you is warm, the liquid inside carrying a faint taste of clay and minerals. No ice cubes, no flavoring, no guarantee of purity. You drink because you must, not because it's particularly satisfying. Your stomach growls again. Meals in the biblical world aren't the predictable, scheduled affairs of modern life. They happen when they can be prepared, when work allows, when food is available. The concept of 3 square meals a day would seem bizarre and luxurious. Most people make do with a morning meal and an evening meal, with perhaps some bread or dried fruit eaten, while working if resources allow. The food itself looks nothing like what fills modern grocery stores. Vegetables are smaller, less uniform, bearing the marks of insect damage and natural variation. Fruits are seasonal, available only during specific weeks of the year, not shipped from across the globe regardless of local growing conditions. Meat is a luxury, not a daily expectation. When animals are slaughtered, it's an event and every part is utilized, blood, organs, and all. Nothing resembling modern food safety standards exists. You eat what's available, and you hope your body can handle what might be lurking in it. As you watch people move through their daily routines, you realize how much knowledge is required just to exist in this world. Not academic knowledge from books and universities, but practical, hands-on wisdom passed through generations. How to judge if water is safe to drink, how to preserve food through seasons, how to treat common ailments with available plants, how to construct shelters that withstand local weather patterns, how to navigate without maps or signs, using landmarks and natural features instead. Modern specialization has made us experts in narrow fields, while biblical people needed to be generalists in 100 small but vital areas. Their survival depended not on deep knowledge of one subject, but on sufficient knowledge of everything their environment might throw at them. The social fabric around you operates on different principles too. There's no privacy as modern people understand it. Dwellings house extended families, grandparents, parents, children, sometimes uncles and aunts, all sharing limited space. Conversations aren't held behind closed doors, but within earshot of everyone. Personal space isn't a concept that would translate. Bodies share sleeping areas, eating areas, working areas with a proximity that would feel invasive to contemporary sensibilities. Your modern psychology rebels against the constant presence of others, the unending social interaction with no escape into private moments. Here, solitude is rare, almost unnatural. Humans function as permanent units, family groups, work collectives. Village structures, not as autonomous individuals pursuing personal fulfillment. The biblical world is intensely hierarchical. Every person has a place determined largely by birth, with limited mobility between social strata. Gender roles aren't suggestions or preferences, but rigid frameworks dictating every aspect of life from appropriate clothing to permitted occupations. Age confers authority in ways the youth, obsessed modern world has abandoned. To be old is to be respected, to be young is to be instructed and directed. As afternoon wears on, you observe the thousand small tasks required just to prepare for nightfall. Lamps must be filled with olive oil, wicks trimmed. Without electricity, darkness is absolute and must be actively countered. Food for the evening meal must be prepared while light remains. Animals must be secured against predators and thieves. Water stores must be replenished for morning needs. Nothing is automatic. Nothing happens without direct human effort. Every comfort, every necessity, every tool requires someone's labor to produce, maintain, and utilize. The biblical world doesn't allow passive consumption of resources, but demands active participation in their creation and management. You notice an older man limping past, his leg bearing the marks of an old injury that clearly never healed properly. In the biblical world, a broken bone, a deep wound, or a serious illness means permanent change to one's physical capabilities. No orthopedic surgery, no physical therapy, no corrective procedures. Injuries write irreversible chapters in the story your body tells. His limp isn't a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent alteration to his identity and capacity. Children play nearby with utter absence of manufactured toys. No plastic, no electronics, no mass-produced games with instruction manuals. They use sticks, stones, fragments of pottery, creating entertainment from imagination and available materials. Their play isn't separated from learning, but seamlessly integrates skills they'll need as adults. Counting, sorting, physical coordination, social negotiation. A group of women work fabric at the village edge. The process so different from modern textile production, it's barely recognizable as the same activity. First, spinning wool or flax into thread using simple drop spindles, a process so labor-intensive that in ancient times, a woman might spend every spare moment spinning just to keep her family clothed. Then, weaving thread into fabric on looms that haven't fundamentally changed in design for thousands of years. A garment represents not hours but weeks of labor, which explains why clothing is mentioned as valuable items in biblical texts, worth stealing or specifically bequeathing to heirs. As evening approaches, new sounds emerge. Birds calling their evening songs, insects beginning their nightly chorus, people calling family members home for the final meal of the day. Without artificial lighting extending activities into night hours, the rhythm of life follows the sun with a strictness modern schedules have abandoned. The smell of cooking fires intensifies as the main meal preparations begin in earnest. Flatbread baking on hot stones, stews of lentils or occasionally meat simmering in clay pots, herbs adding complexity to otherwise simple ingredients. Hunger sharpens your senses, makes these smells almost painfully enticing. Families gather in courtyards or on rooftops as the heat of the day dissipates. This is the social hour, when work largely pauses and community strengthens through shared meals, conversation, storytelling. Without electronic entertainment, human interaction becomes the primary source of information and diversion. Stories aren't just entertainment, but vehicles for history, moral instruction, practical wisdom, and cultural identity. You're invited to join a family's evening meal. The food is served communally, no individual plates, no separate portions. Everyone takes from shared vessels, using bread as both utensil and food. No forks, knives, or spoons apart from serving implements. The intimacy of this dining style, hands in shared food, close physical proximity, reflects the communal nature of biblical life. The meal itself is simple by modern standards, flatbread, a lentil stew with onions and herbs, some fermented dairy similar to yogurt, perhaps olives if the family has resources. A clay jug of watered wine passes between adults, not for intoxication, but because fermentation makes the liquid safer than water alone. Children receive watered wine as well, the alcohol content low, but sufficient to kill harmful microorganisms. As darkness falls completely, lamplight creates islands of warm illumination. The quality of this light differs fundamentally from electric lighting. It flickers, creating moving shadows that transform familiar surroundings into mysterious landscapes. It's directional, leaving corners in darkness. It's limited, allowing you to see what's immediately before you but obscuring anything at distance. The night brings new challenges. Without indoor plumbing, natural functions require venturing outside, navigating dark pathways to designated areas. Without climate control, sleeping arrangements must adapt to dropping temperatures. Additional blankets of rough wool, bodies positioned for shared warmth. Without solid doors and security systems, the night brings vulnerability to both human and animal threats that must be mitigated through community watchfulness. Conversation quiets as fatigue from the day's physical demands takes hold. Without artificial stimulants like caffeine keeping people alert past natural limits, sleep comes earlier and more predictably. The biblical cycle of rest doesn't wait for Netflix episodes to finish or social media feeds to be exhausted. As you lie on your sleeping mat, feeling every stone and uneven spot beneath the thin padding, you catalogue the discomforts of this world. The perpetual thirst, the constant presence of dust and insects, the physical exhaustion from tasks modern machinery would accomplish in minutes, the ambient pain from minor injuries and ailments that have no convenient treatments. Yet there's something else too, a groundedness missing from modern existence, a direct connection to the processes that sustain life, a visceral understanding of what matters for survival and what constitutes unnecessary excess. The biblical world strips existence to essentials in ways that clarify priorities and illuminate dependencies modern convenience obscures. Your backache is from unfamiliar labor. Your skin burns from sun exposure. Your muscles protest movements they're unaccustomed to performing. Your digestive system struggles with unfamiliar bacteria and food preparations. Your modern immune system faces challenges it hasn't evolved to combat efficiently. In short, your every bodily system confirms what was apparent from the moment you arrived. You weren't made for this world. Your modern adaptations, physical, psychological, social, developed in environments so removed from biblical reality that the transition would likely prove fatal long before you could adjust. This is the truth of biblical immersion, not the sanitized imagery of children's Bibles or Hollywood epics, but the harsh, uncompromising reality of human existence before technology created buffers between people and their environment, before medicine extended lifespans and improved quality of life, before industrial production separated consumers from the labor of creation. As your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, lulled by genuine physical exhaustion rather than electronic screens, you understand something profound about biblical texts. They emerge from this reality, from lives shaped by these constraints, these rhythms, these necessities. The concerns they address, the values they champion, the worldviews they reflect make different sense when experienced within their original context, rather than interpreted through modern lenses. The sounds of the village settling for night surround you, distant conversations, animals shifting in their enclosures, the crack and pop of cooking fires burning down to embers. These sounds lack the mechanical quality of modern noise pollution. No engines, no electronic hums, no distant highway rumble. They're organic, variable, directly connected to specific actions by living beings. Sleep comes differently here, not at the end of digital wind, down routines or pharmaceutical assistance, but as the natural conclusion to physical exertion, as unavoidable as hunger or thirst. Your modern insomnia, fueled by artificial light and stimulation, finds little purchase in a world where bodies work until they must rest, where darkness is complete enough to trigger melatonin production without interruption. You drift into unconsciousness with one final realization: every biblical story, every psalm, every proverb, every prophetic utterance happened in conditions like these. The text modern readers consume in climate-controlled buildings, seated on comfortable furniture, with full stomachs and medical concerns addressed, originated in this world of immediate physical demands and limitless vulnerability to forces beyond human control. The biblical world shapes biblical thinking in ways modern minds must actively work to comprehend. Here in the dark, as your breathing slows and your mind quiets, that comprehension comes not intellectually, but experientially. You aren't studying the biblical world anymore. For tonight, at least you're living it. Morning arrives with merciless swiftness in the biblical world. No gentle alarm with snooze function, just the harsh reality of sunlight streaming through the small window opening of your dwelling. Sleep clings to you, but luxury isn't an option here. Your body aches from the unfamiliar hardness of your sleeping mat, joints protesting as you move. This isn't temporary discomfort. This is everyday life for everyone around you. Water becomes your first conscious need. Your throat feels like parchment, dry and scratchy. Modern life has trained you to expect hydration to be simple, trivial even. A tap, a bottle, a drinking fountain, water always within arm's reach, purified and safe. Here, obtaining water shapes entire days, dictates settlement patterns, and determines survival. You join a group of women heading to the village well. The clay jar they hand you is heavier than expected even when empty. The concept of personal water bottles hasn't been invented yet. These vessels weigh several pounds and hold enough for a family's immediate needs, which means multiple trips daily. Water isn't measured in 8 convenient glasses, but in back-breaking journeys carrying 30 pounds of liquid balanced precariously on head or hip. At the well, you witness the social dynamics that modern plumbing erased. Wells aren't just utilitarian structures, but community hubs where information flows as freely as water. Conversations swirl around you: who's ill, who's expecting, who's feuding, who's courting. This is social media in its most literal form, where faces meet rather than screens, where no algorithm filters what you hear, where relationships form and fracture around this life-giving resource. The physical act of drawing water staggers you. No button to press, no handle to turn. A rope must be lowered, a bucket filled, then hauled up hand over hand from depths that make your arms burn with effort. Your first attempt ends with the bucket crashing back down, splashing precious liquid and earning you disapproving glances. Your second attempt succeeds, only because an elderly woman steadies your hands with her own fingers, gnarled from decades of this exact labor. Skin like leather from constant sun exposure. Carrying the filled jar back to your dwelling is an exercise in humiliation. The women around you move with practiced grace, containers balanced on heads, hands free for other tasks, or to steady children walking alongside. You stumble, water sloshing over the rim, each drop representing wasted effort. By the time you return, your shoulders scream with tension. Your lower back threatens revolt, and you've lost nearly a quarter of your water to inexperience. And this water, it isn't the clear, tasteless liquid you're accustomed to. It carries minerals, sediment, perhaps microscopic life you'd rather not contemplate. No filtration systems, no chlorination, no testing standards. You drink because you must, not because it's appealing. Your modern intestinal flora quivers at the bacterial introduction, and you realize why dysentery and other waterborne illnesses claimed so many biblical lives. Food presents the next fundamental challenge. Your morning hunger isn't answered with a quick bowl of cereal or grab-and-go protein bar. Breakfast in the biblical world is simple, often just leftover bread from yesterday, perhaps dipped in olive oil or with a few olives on the side. The concept of specific breakfast foods wouldn't develop for millennia. You eat what's available when it's available, grateful for its existence rather than its variety or convenience. The bread itself bears no resemblance to the uniform, soft, crusted loaves lining modern grocery shelves. It's flatbread, dense and chewy, requiring substantial jaw strength to consume. The grain wasn't processed in massive industrial mills, but ground by hand between stones, leaving tiny mineral particles that gradually wear down teeth over decades of consumption. Modern dentistry doesn't exist to repair this damage. Once teeth are worn down or lost, they're gone forever, making eating increasingly difficult with age. As morning progresses, you join others in food preparation. Nothing comes pre-measured, pre-washed, pre-anything. Lentils must be sorted by hand, each tiny stone or damaged legume removed by careful fingers. This isn't a 5-minute kitchen prep, but an hour or more of concentrated effort just to make a simple meal safe to consume. The sensory experience strikes you, the repetitive finger movements, the subtle differences in texture between good lentils and debris, the communal nature of work that modern efficiency has rendered solitary. You're handed vegetables to prepare, and the knife provided is nothing like the balanced, sharp, edged tools of modern kitchens. It's crude metal or flint, requiring more sawing than slicing, more force than finesse. Your cuts are uneven, clumsy compared to those of people who've done this daily for years. The vegetables themselves are smaller, tougher, less juicy than their genetically modified modern descendants. Every food item represents someone's direct labor, sowing, tending, harvesting, preserving, not abstract economic exchanges separated from production. Cooking happens over an open fire, not with temperature-controlled dials and digital timers. Heat management is an art form learned through years of burned meals and wasted fuel. You watch as women add wood strategically, shift pots marginally, judge doneness by sight and smell rather than preset durations. The smoke stings your eyes, works its way into your clothing, your hair, your skin. In the biblical world, everyone carries the scent of wood smoke. It's not a pleasant camping memory, but a permanent olfactory backdrop to existence. The meal emerges, a simple lentil stew flavored with wild herbs, and a small amount of preserved fish for those who can afford such luxury. No complex sauces, no layered flavor profiles developed by professional chefs. Food isn't entertainment or artistic expression, but sustenance. Fuel for bodies that must labor to secure tomorrow's meals. You eat communally, without individual plates or privacy, from a shared vessel using bread as your utensil. The intimacy of this dining style, hands in shared food, reflects fundamental biblical values, where individualism yields to community in ways modern independence finds uncomfortable. With basic needs of water and food temporarily addressed, you become aware of other physical realities the biblical world presents. Bathing isn't a daily affair but a luxury constrained by water availability. The concept of personal hygiene differs fundamentally. No deodorant, no shampoo, no toothpaste. Bodies smell like bodies, like sweat, like work, like humanity uncensored by modern chemistry. This isn't considered offensive but normal, unremarkable. Only the wealthiest might use oils or rudimentary perfumes to mask these natural odors. Waste elimination presents its own stark realities. No porcelain fixtures, no flushing mechanisms, no scented products to mask biological functions. Depending on the setting, you might use designated areas outside settlements, rudimentary pit latrines shared by multiple families, or chamber pots emptied manually into larger waste collection points. Privacy during these functions is limited or non-existent. The concept of bathroom breaks being solitary Private affairs is a modern luxury, not a biblical expectation. The absence of toilet paper, a seemingly simple product, changes everyday experience profoundly. Various alternatives exist: smooth stones, leaves, small sponges on sticks for the relatively wealthy, one's left hand followed by washing for everyone else. This fundamental reality explains biblical prohibitions against using the left hand for certain activities and offers visceral understanding of cleanliness regulations that modern readers might dismiss as merely ceremonial. Personal cleanliness involves different standards when water is precious and soap is a luxury item made from ash and animal fats. You observe people cleaning hands by rubbing with sand before meals, a practical if abrasive solution in water-scarce environments. Full body bathing might happen weekly at most, often in communal settings rather than private bathrooms. The sensation of perpetual dirtness, dust in every crease and crevice of your body, becomes another constant companion in biblical life. As midday approaches, the heat intensifies to levels modern climate. Controlled environments have insulated you from experiencing. This isn't discomfort but danger. Without rehydration solutions, without understanding of heat stroke mechanisms, the sun becomes an active threat to survival. You watch as activity patterns shift, work pausing during the most intense heat, resuming in early morning and late afternoon. These aren't scheduling preferences, but survival adaptations shaped by environmental realities that can't be technologically overcome. You seek shade as locals do, resting during this forced pause in the day's labor. The concept of continuous productivity, regardless of external conditions, is a modern invention. Biblical life flows with natural rhythms rather than imposing human schedules upon them. This midday rest isn't laziness but wisdom, a recognition of human limitations within hostile environmental conditions. As you sit in relative coolness beneath a stone overhang, an older man begins speaking. No books, no written notes, just memory and practiced cadence as he recounts stories you vaguely recognize from religious texts. But hearing them here, in their original setting, transforms their meaning. These aren't abstract spiritual lessons, but practical wisdom for survival, coded instructions for avoiding dangers, explanations for natural phenomena that would otherwise remain terrifying mysteries. You realize that biblical texts emerged from this oral tradition, stories refined through countless tellings, shaped to be memorable rather than merely informative. The repetitions, the patterns, the vivid imagery that modern readers might consider stylistic choices were actually memory devices ensuring vital knowledge survived across generations in a world where literacy was exceptional rather than expected. As he speaks, you notice how the audience responds, nodding at practical wisdom, leaning forward during descriptions of divine intervention, murmuring agreement at moral conclusions. These aren't passive consumers of entertainment, but active participants in cultural transmission. The biblical world doesn't separate religious instruction from practical living. The same stories that explain cosmic origins also contain embedded lessons about which plants are safe to eat, which weather patterns predict storms, which human behaviors lead to community breakdown. The afternoon brings new awareness of immediate dangers the biblical world presents. A child runs past with a small cut on his leg, trivial in modern terms, potentially fatal here. No antibiotics exist to combat infection. No sterile bandages to protect wounds. No antimicrobial ointments to prevent bacterial growth. The slightest injury creates vulnerability to sepsis, to gangrene, to systemic infection that medical science would later learn to combat, but that biblical people could only watch progress with helpless dread. You observe mothers examining children for signs of illness with practiced intensity. Fever isn't an inconvenience managed with the counter medication, but a terrifying harbinger of potential death. Childhood diseases that modern vaccination has rendered historical curiosities, measles, mumps, whooping cough, here claim lives routinely, shaping family planning, emotional attachment, and communal support systems. Parents in the biblical world don't expect all their children to survive to adulthood. This brutal reality influences everything from naming practices to inheritance patterns. Near the village edge, you notice a woman in labor surrounded by other women. Childbirth in the biblical world stands as perhaps the starkest example of danger hidden behind sanitized modern understanding. No fetal monitoring, no cesarean sections for difficult presentations, no pain management beyond perhaps wine or herbal preparations of questionable efficacy. Maternal mortality rates approach 1 in 10 births. Infant mortality claims as many as half of all children before age 5. The miracle isn't that some died in childbirth, but that any survived at all. The women's faces show concern but not panic. This isn't an unusual emergency but routine danger, as expected as sunrise, as common as hunger. Their hands move with practiced efficiency, positioning the laboring woman, preparing clean cloths, offering encouragement and practical assistance. You realize these aren't midwives in the professional sense, but simply women who've witnessed enough births to develop useful knowledge. Their expertise isn't certified by institutions, but proven through successful outcomes in previous deliveries. As you watch from a respectful distance, understanding dawns. Biblical references to barren women, to difficult deliveries, to women dying in childbirth aren't dramatic literary devices, but reflections of everyday reality, of universal fears that shaped entire cultural systems around fertility, gender roles, and community support structures. Moving away from this intimate scene, you encounter men returning from agricultural labor. Their skin is weathered beyond their years, hands calloused and permanently stained from soil contact. Modern farming with air-conditioned tractor cabs and GPS guided equipment bears no resemblance to this back-breaking manual effort. These aren't recreational gardeners, but people engaged in constant battle against starvation, against crop failure, against environmental conditions that can render months of labor worthless in a single stormy afternoon. Their conversations revolve around signs of impending weather, cloud formations, animal behaviors, wind patterns. No meteorological services provide 5-day forecasts. No irrigation systems mitigate drought. No crop insurance softens the blow of failure. They navigate uncertainty with observation-based predictions refined through generations of trial and catastrophic error. When biblical texts reference weather events, they aren't discussing minor inconveniences, but existential threats to entire communities. As evening approaches, new dangers emerge. Darkness in the biblical world isn't merely the absence of light, but the presence of vulnerability. No street lamps illuminate pathways. No emergency services stand ready to respond to crisis. No communication systems connect separated individuals. Nightfall brings legitimate fears of wild animals, of human predators, of accidental injury without hope of rescue. Oil lamps provide limited illumination, their small flames creating more shadows than light. Fire itself presents constant danger, one careless moment, one gust of wind, one curious child, and entire dwellings could become infernos with no fire departments to contain spread. The biblical world burns easily and frequently, which explains the repeated rebuilding of settlements in archaeological layers, and the emphasis on fire management in religious texts. You witness evening preparations for security, livestock brought into protected enclosures, dwelling entrances blocked with movable stones or simple wooden barriers, groups organizing informal watches throughout the night. Modern security systems with their motion sensors and remote monitoring can't replace the communal vigilance required when darkness brings genuine threat rather than mere inconvenience. The conversation turns to recent reports of bandits operating in nearby hills. No professional police forces patrol rural areas. No centralized justice system deters criminal behavior through consistent consequence. Security exists only through community self-protection and the deterrent effect of retribution. Biblical laws concerning theft, assault, and property damage weren't abstract philosophical positions, but practical responses to constant threats in environments where vulnerability was the default condition. As night falls completely, the sounds change character. Daytime noises of human activity yield to natural sounds more threatening than soothing jackals howling in distance. Unknown creatures moving through undergrowth, the wind creating auditory illusions that trigger primal fear responses. Without scientific understanding of these phenomena, without technology to investigate safely, the biblical world transforms darkness into a realm of genuine mystery and potential supernatural intervention. You find yourself instinctively moving closer to the fire, to other people, to sources of security, both physical and psychological. Modern individualism, with its emphasis on personal space and independence, dissolves under the weight of biblical realities, where survival depends on group cohesion and mutual protection. The profound communal nature of biblical culture isn't a philosophical choice, but a survival necessity in environments where isolation meant certain death. Stories begin around the fire, not mere entertainment, but vehicles for transmitting survival information, cultural identity, religious understanding, and community bonds. Without electronic distractions, without literacy-based alternatives, these oral performances represent the primary method of information storage and retrieval. Their importance explains why biblical texts contain so many memorable narratives rather than abstract philosophical discourses. Ideas needed narrative containers to survive intergenerational transmission in preliterate societies. The stories themselves reflect immediate dangers, tales of individuals who wandered too far from community protection, who failed to respect environmental threats, who violated social norms necessary for group survival. Modern readers might interpret these as simplistic moral lessons, but their original function was profoundly practical, encoding survival information in memorable packages that could be easily recalled when similar dangers presented themselves. As you listen, physical discomforts accumulate. Insects find exposed skin despite smoke's deterrent effect. Your muscles ache from unaccustomed labor. Minor scratches sting without antiseptic attention. Your digestive system protests unfamiliar bacteria. Your head throbs slightly from dehydration despite your best efforts. These aren't exceptional conditions, but the normal physical state of biblical existence, a constant background of minor pains and discomforts that modern medicine has eliminated so completely that their absence feels natural rather than miraculous. The conversation shifts to illness in a nearby village, symptoms described in detail, progression noted, outcomes tallied. Without understanding of germ theory, without microscopic identification of pathogens, illness in the biblical world appears mystically, strikes seemingly at random, progresses without effective intervention. Medical knowledge exists primarily as observation of patterns, as trial and error application of herbal remedies, as religious interpretation of suffering's meaning and purpose. You realize why biblical texts devote so much attention to illness, to healing, to suffering. These weren't occasional interruptions to normal health, but constant companions to human existence, omnipresent threats requiring explanation and response. Modern medicine has so thoroughly transformed this reality that contemporary readers struggle to grasp the physical vulnerability that shaped biblical worldviews at their most fundamental level. Sleep begins claiming those around you, not as scheduled downtime, but as biological necessity, as the body's response to physical depletion. Some maintain watch while others rest, another communal adaptation to environmental threat. You find your own consciousness beginning to fade, not through relaxation techniques or sleep medications, but through genuine exhaustion. Your modern body, unaccustomed to this level of physical demand, surrenders to recovery needs more quickly than those conditioned by lifetime exposure. As you drift toward unconsciousness, awareness lingers on the fundamental reality that separates modern existence from biblical life, the constant presence of imminent danger, not abstract risks managed through insurance policies and safety regulations, but immediate threats to continued existence that required perpetual vigilance, constant adaptation, and community-based protection systems. The biblical world wasn't merely technologically different, but existentially foreign, a landscape where survival represented active achievement rather than default condition, where safety existed only through continuous effort rather than institutional guarantees, where physical vulnerability shaped psychological reality in ways modern minds struggle to comprehend without direct experience. Your breathing slows, your thoughts fragment. Around you, the biblical world continues its dance of necessity and danger, of community and vulnerability, of practical wisdom encoded in religious narrative. These aren't historical curiosities, but the fundamental conditions from which biblical texts emerged, the soil in which spiritual insights took root, the context without which their full meaning remains partially obscured. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new insights, new experiences of biblical reality stripped of modern filters. But for now, genuine physical exhaustion claims consciousness, drawing you into sleep not as escape but as necessary renewal for survival in a world where nothing comes easily, where everything costs physical effort, where danger remains only one careless moment away. The biblical night passes in segments rather than uninterrupted slumber. Your modern expectation of 8 continuous hours dissolves in a world without artificial light. Instead, sleep comes in watches, periods of deeper rest punctuated by moments of wakefulness. This pattern, so different from contemporary sleep hygiene recommendations, represents the natural human sleep cycle before electricity extended days and consolidated nights. You drift through layers of consciousness, aware occasionally of night sounds, of others shifting nearby, of the persistent hard ground beneath your thin sleeping mat. Pre-dawn brings stirring among those around you. No alarm clocks needed when survival depends on maximizing daylight hours. The dark still holds danger, but work must begin with first light. Modern schedules with their weekend breaks and vacation allowances have no place here. Biblical life maintains constant vigilance against threats that never take holidays: hunger, thirst, exposure, predators both animal and human. Your body protests as you rise. Muscles unaccustomed to yesterday's labor have stiffened overnight. Joints crack with movement. Your modern existence hasn't prepared physical systems for this level of constant demand. What biblical people consider normal baseline discomfort would send contemporary individuals seeking medical intervention. Yet here, no one complains of aches that represent universal experience rather than individual affliction. The morning brings immediate awareness of new dangers. You notice a small cut on your hand, probably from food preparation yesterday. In your world, this would warrant nothing more than perhaps an adhesive bandage, quickly forgotten. Here, it presents genuine threat. Infection in the biblical world doesn't mean a course of antibiotics, but potential progression to systemic illness with no effective intervention. You see people examining even minor wounds with serious attention, applying herbal poultices with uncertain efficacy, but representing the best available treatment. An older woman approaches, examining your cut with experienced eyes. She applies a paste of crushed herbs mixed with honey. The mixture stings, but you recognize honey's antibacterial properties, one of the few effective treatments available. Her wrinkled hands move with practiced efficiency born from treating countless similar injuries, from watching some heal and others worsen beyond recovery. You understand now why biblical texts contain so many healing narratives, why recovery from even minor ailments warranted celebration and religious significance. As early light strengthens, you become aware of another constant danger wildlife encounters. A commotion erupts at the settlement edge as shepherds drive away what appears to be a wolf or jackal attempting to reach livestock. These aren't rare occurrences but daily realities. Predators in the biblical world don't remain conveniently distant in wildlife preserves, but actively compete with humans for resources. Biblical references to lions, bears, and wolves aren't poetic metaphors, but reflections of genuine threats requiring constant vigilance. The shepherds return, discussing the encounter with remarkable casualness. This isn't an unusual event but routine danger. You notice one carries a sling, not a child's toy, but a lethal weapon in practiced hands. The biblical David slaying Goliath with such an implement isn't miraculous fantasy, but the application of common skill developed through constant necessity. These shepherds don't merely watch flocks, but actively defend them against predators, against thieves, against environmental threats. Their profession isn't peaceful pastoral idyll, but constant confrontation with danger. As morning activities begin in earnest, you observe another threat unique to biblical life: community conflict without modern resolution mechanisms. Two men argue heatedly over a property boundary, their voices rising, bodies tensing toward potential violence. No police can be called, no courts offer impartial judgment, no legal documents definitively establish ownership. Conflict resolution depends on community standards, on elder intervention, on shared religious principles, and ultimately on the threat of escalation that could damage both parties beyond any potential gain. An older man steps between them, speaking with authority derived not from institutional position, but from respected character. Others gather, forming an impromptu tribunal weighing evidence, considering precedent, seeking resolution that preserves community cohesion. You realize biblical laws concerning witnesses, concerning restitution, concerning proportional response, didn't represent arbitrary religious requirements, but practical solutions to maintaining order in societies without professional enforcement mechanisms. The dispute resolves through combination of public pressure, face-saving compromise, and implied threat of community sanctions against unreasonable behavior. This isn't abstract justice, but practical peacekeeping. Biblical communities couldn't afford unresolved conflicts that might erupt into blood feuds, into resource destruction, into divisions that weakened collective defense against external threats. Social harmony wasn't philosophical ideal, but survival necessity. As the morning progresses, you witness another danger of biblical existence: childhood threat levels inconceivable to modern parents. Children as young as 4 participate in genuinely hazardous activities, tending cooking fires, carrying water from distant sources, helping with livestock significantly larger and stronger than themselves. No safety regulations protect them. No child-proofing limits access to dangerous tools or substances. No societal expectation shields them from witnessing birth, death, slaughter, and sexual activity. A small boy, perhaps 5 or 6, uses a knife nearly as long as his forearm to help process vegetables, his small fingers alarmingly close to the cutting edge. Nobody intervenes because this isn't exceptional but normal, expected, necessary. Children in the biblical world don't occupy protected status with gradually introduced responsibilities, but integrate into survival activities as soon as physically capable. Their value isn't sentimental, but practical additional hands ensuring collective survival. You watch a girl slightly older carrying her infant sibling, while simultaneously collecting firewood, the baby secured to her back with woven cloth. Her expression holds neither resentment nor confusion, but serious purpose. Childhood in the biblical world isn't extended period of protected development, but brief transition to productive contribution. The modern concept of adolescence as distinct life phase doesn't exist here. One is a child until capable of adult work, then an adult bearing full responsibilities, regardless of emotional development or psychological readiness. These observations illuminate biblical attitudes toward children valued not as individuals with unique development trajectories, but as insurance against mortality, as labor resources, as continuation of family lineage. The high infant death rate shapes attachment patterns, naming practices, even the timing of celebration rituals. Biblical communities couldn't afford the intensive, individual-focused children modern parents consider normal and necessary. This doesn't mean children aren't loved. You observe plenty of affectionate interactions, playful moments, protective gestures, but the emotional dynamics differ fundamentally from contemporary parent-child relationships. Biblical children belong to the community first, the family second, existing as integral components of survival systems rather than projects of parental self-actualization. Their development focuses on practical skills rather than abstract knowledge, on conformity to group norms rather than individual expression. As midday approaches, another immediate danger emerges, the ever-present threat of food contamination. Without refrigeration, without preservatives, without food safety regulations or germ theory understanding, every meal represents potential illness. You observe food preparation with new awareness of risk factors invisible to participants. Contamination between raw and cooked items, inadequate cooking temperatures, exposure to insects as disease vectors. The woman preparing the communal meal sniffs a piece of dried meat carefully before adding it to the pot, using senses refined by necessity to detect spoilage. This isn't scientific food safety, but experiential judgment honed through generations of trial and error, of witnessing consequences from poor decisions. Biblical dietary laws regarding clean and unclean foods weren't arbitrary religious distinctions, but codified observations about which foods most commonly caused illness in specific environmental conditions. Mealtime arrives with its own dangers. Food shared communally creates perfect conditions for disease transmission. Hands dip into common vessels. Water is drunk from shared cups. Bread is torn from the same loaf. Modern individual portion control with separate utensils doesn't exist. Biblical communities couldn't afford such inefficiencies in resource utilization, instead developing cultural practices to minimize risks, ritual hand washing, seating arrangements based on health status, serving chronology placing vulnerable members last to reduce exposure. You appreciate now why biblical texts contain so many references to cleanliness rituals, to proper food handling, to exclusion of visibly ill individuals from certain community activities. These weren't superstitious practices, but practical public health measures based on observable patterns of disease transmission, lacking scientific explanation, but recognizing tangible cause, effect relationships between specific behaviors and illness outbreaks. The afternoon brings awareness of more subtle dangers, the psychological burdens of biblical existence. Without modern understanding of mental health, without pharmaceutical interventions for anxiety or depression, without therapeutic frameworks for processing trauma, biblical people carried psychological weights modern minds would find debilitating. You observe coping mechanisms embedded in daily routines, rhythmic work movements, almost meditative in nature, communal storytelling that contextualizes suffering within larger narratives, religious practices providing structure and meaning to otherwise chaotic experiences. An older woman sits slightly apart, rocking and murmuring to herself. Others acknowledge her presence with gentle attention, but no attempt at intervention or remedy. Her behavior indicates what modern diagnosis might identify as post-traumatic response, perhaps to lost children, to witnessed violence, to any of countless traumas biblical life regularly delivered. Without clinical treatment options, communities accommodated such manifestations as natural variations in human response to unbearable circumstances. This observation illuminates biblical references to individuals described as possessed, as afflicted by spirits, as exhibiting behavior outside normal parameters. Without psychiatric framework, without neurological understanding, communities explain psychological differences through available conceptual systems, religious, supernatural, moral. These weren't merely ignorant misattributions, but attempts to categorize and respond to observable phenomena using available interpretive tools. As you continue through the day, social structures of biblical life emerge more clearly, revealing both protections against immediate dangers and potential threats in themselves. The hierarchical nature of relationships, determined by age, gender, family position, economic status, creates rigid frameworks limiting individual autonomy, but providing predictable social interactions essential for community function. Modern egalitarian values, with their emphasis on personal freedom, would threaten rather than enhance survival in environments where coordinated action under recognized authority often determine collective outcomes. You observe the position of women with particular interest. Their status reflects practical necessity rather than inherent inequality. Division of labor isn't philosophical statement, but survival adaptation matching biological realities with critical functional needs. Women's work, food preparation, water collection, textile production, child supervision keeps everyone alive just as directly as male-dominated activities like defense, construction, and agricultural production. The interdependence creates mutual value recognition, even within power differential that modern perspective would consider oppressive. This doesn't mean women experience their position as equitable or optimal. You notice subtle resistance strategies, information networks operating through apparently casual conversation, influence exercised through relationship management rather than direct authority, solidarity expressed through shared labor creating bonds outside male oversight. Biblical texts occasionally reveal these dynamics through stories of women exercising agency despite structural limitations, Deborah leading, Ruth determining her path, Esther manipulating political outcomes through carefully managed relationships. Religious practices emerge throughout the day, revealing their practical function beyond spiritual significance. Prayers before planting aren't merely devotional, but mark optimal seasonal timing. Dietary restrictions correlate with higher risk food categories in pre-scientific preservation conditions. Sabbath observance isn't arbitrary religious obligation, but necessary physical recovery period preventing collapse from continuous labor. Ritual purity requirements frequently align with basic hygiene benefits even without germ theory understanding. You participate in evening prayer gathering, experiencing how religious observance creates community cohesion, psychological resilience, and practical knowledge transmission simultaneously. The psalms sung together aren't merely worship expressions, but memory devices containing historical information, agricultural guidance, and ethical frameworks ensuring community survival. Biblical religion isn't compartmentalized spiritual activity, but integrated survival system addressing physical, psychological, and social needs through practices refined over generations of environmental adaptation. As darkness returns, social activities intensify. Without electric lighting extending productivity, evenings belong to community building rather than individual pursuits. Storytelling begins again, but you notice the content differs from children's versions of biblical narratives. These accounts contain graphic elements, sexual content, violent episodes that modern religious education typically sanitizes. Biblical stories in their original context weren't moral fables for innocent minds, but complex reflections of actual human experience, addressing adult concerns about desire, violence, betrayal, and power. An elder begins recounting what you recognize as the David and Bathsheba narrative. This isn't presented as distant historical event, but as cautionary tale about power abuse, about consequences from violated community standards, about divine judgment equalizing human inequity. The listeners respond with knowing nods, with murmured comments reflecting recognition of similar dynamics in their own community. Biblical narratives weren't abstract religious instruction, but practical ethics education directly applicable to immediate social contexts. The storyteller doesn't shy from explicit details: Bathsheba's bathing, David's desire, the calculated murder of Uriah, the death of the resulting child. No content warnings preface potentially disturbing material because biblical audiences didn't expect protection from reality's harshness. These stories reflect actual experience, actual temptations, actual consequences familiar to communities intimately acquainted with desire, violence, and suffering. Their power derives precisely from unflinching confrontation with human capacity for both transcendent love and horrific cruelty. This experience transforms your understanding of biblical texts. Their original function wasn't providing sanitized moral instruction, but addressing the full complexity of human existence in environments where survival required both cooperation and competition, both compassion and strategic violence, both adherence to community standards and recognition of their frequent violation. The unedited content reflects societies that couldn't afford illusions about human nature, but required clear-eyed assessment of both potential and limitation. Night settles fully, bringing limitations to activity, but intensifying social bonding. Without privacy as modern people understand it, without individual space ensuring emotional distance, biblical communities develop different psychological boundaries. Conversation flows between practical planning and deeper emotional exchange without clear demarcation. Physical proximity, bodies pressed together for warmth, for security, for simple space limitation, creates sensory intimacy modern individuals rarely experience outside romantic or familial relationships. You find yourself participating in conversation with decreasing self-consciousness. The boundaries of personal disclosure shifting under environmental pressures that make isolation more threatening than vulnerability. This isn't modern opening up as therapeutic choice, but necessary information sharing ensuring group cohesion and survival. Biblical communities couldn't afford emotional distance that might weaken responsive action in crisis situations. Someone begins singing softly, others joining gradually until the melody encompasses everyone present. No instruments accompany human voices rising and falling in patterns clearly familiar to all but you. This isn't performance but participation, not entertainment but community affirmation through shared cultural expression. Biblical references to singing, to musical worship, to joyful noise reflect these moments where collective voice creates bonds strengthening cooperative action. When survival demands unified response, the singing subsides, conversation resuming in quieter tones as fatigue begins claiming peripheral awareness. Around you, people settle into sleeping positions that modern individuals would consider intrusive, bodies touching, breath mingling, personal space essentially non-existent. This isn't cultural difference, but practical necessity in environments where shared body heat determines survival in colder seasons, where physical proximity permits immediate response to threat, where watchfulness operates in rotation rather than simultaneously. As your own consciousness begins drifting toward sleep, fundamental realization solidifies. Biblical texts emerged from this reality, not from individual authors expressing personal insight, but from communities distilling collective wisdom through narrative frameworks, ensuring transmission across generations. Their content addresses survival, critical information needs rather than abstract philosophical questions. Their form reflects memory requirements in pre-literate societies rather than literary convention. Their purpose integrates practical guidance with meaning, making rather than separating secular and sacred domains. The biblical world surrounding you has transformed abstract understanding into embodied knowledge. Texts that modern readers encounter as religious documents, separated from practical application, originated as survival manuals encoding generations of hard-won wisdom about human needs, human limitations, human relationships, and human environment. Their spiritual insights didn't develop despite harsh physical realities, but because of them, transcendent meaning extracted from immanent experience through collective interpretive effort. Your modern assumptions about individual identity, about personal choice, about privacy rights, about self-actualization collide with biblical reality, where survival depends on community cohesion, on accepted authority, on shared resources, on collective rather than individual good. Neither perspective is absolutely right or wrong. Each represents adaptation to specific environmental conditions, technological capacities, and historical circumstances. But biblical texts cannot be fully understood when interpreted through frameworks that would have been not merely foreign, but actively dangerous in their original context. Sleep claims you again, your body surrendering to physical demand despite intellectual fascination with these insights. The biblical world continues around you, breath rising and falling in shared rhythm. Occasional murmurs punctuating deeper silence, physical presence creating security. Modern locks and alarm systems attempt to replicate through technology rather than human connection. Tomorrow will bring new insights, new challenges, new experiences of biblical reality stripped from modern filtration systems. But tonight, surrounded by others engaged in the perpetual struggle for survival that defined human existence for millennia, you understand something fundamental about sacred texts. They weren't written for comfort, but for continued existence. Their harshness reflects environmental reality rather than divine cruelty. Their God doesn't exempt followers from suffering, but provides meaning framework, transforming inevitable pain into comprehensible experience. As consciousness fades completely, final thought forms with perfect clarity. Biblical faith didn't emerge despite harsh realities, but because of them. When survival remains perpetually uncertain, when control over fundamental outcomes proves consistently limited, when suffering defies prevention through any available technology, meaning itself becomes necessary survival tool, not as escapist fantasy, but as psychological framework allowing continued function, despite full awareness of limitation, vulnerability, and mortality. The biblical world sleeps around you, bodies rising and falling with breath that continues despite everything threatening its cessation. This perpetual persistence against overwhelming odds represents the fundamental miracle biblical faith acknowledges and celebrates not supernatural intervention, suspending natural law, but human capacity to continue functioning, creating, connecting, and finding meaning within natural limitations that cannot be transcended, but must be inhabited fully. And in this fundamental insight, sleep finally claims you completely. The new day brings awareness of physical challenges that define biblical existence. Your body has begun adaptation processes. Muscles that screamed in protest yesterday merely mutter today. Skin exposed to harsh sun has initiated darkening responses. Digestive system has started accommodating unfamiliar bacteria. But these adjustments barely scratch the surface of physical realities biblical people navigate from birth. Moving through morning routines, you observe the elderly with new understanding. Aging in the biblical world isn't gradual decline managed through medications, mobility aids, and supportive services, but stark confrontation with accumulated physical damage that cannot be repaired or compensated for. An old man struggles to stand, his spine permanently curved from decades of agricultural labor. His hands, twisted by arthritis, can barely grasp his walking staff, yet he continues contributing, his experience and knowledge providing value, even as physical capacity diminishes. The oldest individuals you see might be 50 or 60, though they appear much older by modern standards. Concepts like retirement, senior communities, or leisure years don't exist. People work until they physically cannot, then transition to less demanding tasks rather than stopping completely. Biblical references to elders aren't merely age designations, but recognize those who've survived long enough to accumulate wisdom worth preserving, an achievement remarkable enough to warrant respect in environments where reaching old age represents extraordinary resilience rather than expected outcome. A woman nearby prepares food, despite obvious vision impairment, her fingers compensating through touch for what her eyes can no longer discern. No corrective lenses exist for common conditions like presbyopia. No cataract surgery restores clarity to clouded vision. No reading glasses enable continued text access. Biblical references to blindness aren't merely describing complete sight absence, but encompassing visual impairments that modern interventions render inconvenient rather than debilitating. Dental issues present particularly striking physical challenges. You notice many adults with missing teeth, others with visible abscesses or infection indicators. No professional dentistry exists to repair damage or prevent progression. No pain management beyond alcohol or herbal preparations mitigates the agony of exposed nerves or infected roots. The biblical gnashing of teeth as suffering metaphor reflects intimate familiarity with dental pain as universal, unavoidable experience beyond effective intervention. These observations illuminate seemingly minor biblical references with profound significance, passages mentioning the blind, the lame, those with skin diseases or chronic bleeding conditions take on different meaning when such afflictions represent permanent states rather than temporary inconveniences awaiting medical resolution. The biblical world doesn't separate people into disabled and abled categories, but recognizes degree of function within universal experience of progressive physical limitation and eventual failure. Moving beyond the settlement, you accompany others to agricultural fields, experiencing physical challenges specific to food production without modern technology. The plow you're handed bears no resemblance to mechanized equipment, but requires constant physical engagement, guiding, adjusting pressure, removing obstacles, while domesticated animals provide motive force. This isn't casual gardening, but grueling, all-day exertion determining whether community eats adequately or faces shortage. The field itself presents physical obstacles. Modern farming has engineered away rocks, continually emerging from soil through natural processes. Uneven ground creating drainage issues and cultivation difficulties. Persistent weeds competing for limited nutrients and water. Biblical agricultural parables referencing soil conditions, stones, and thorns aren't poetic metaphors, but direct descriptions of daily challenges farmers faced. When Jesus spoke of seeds falling on rocky ground, his audience didn't need explanation, but nodded with immediate recognition of familiar struggle. You participate in water management efforts, digging shallow channels to direct limited rainfall toward crops, clearing debris from existing irrigation systems, carrying water from distant sources to plants showing stress signs. Modern agricultural methods with their computerized irrigation, their soil amendments, their genetic modifications to increase drought resistance have obscured how thoroughly water scarcity defined biblical agriculture. References to rain as blessing, to drought as curse reflect existential dependency on weather patterns human effort could influence only marginally through primitive water management techniques. The physical toll accumulates through repeated lifting, bending, pulling and carrying without ergonomic tools, without protective equipment, without scheduled breaks or regulated work hours. Modern occupational safety standards, with their emphasis on injury prevention through proper technique and equipment design, don't exist. Biblical workers continue through pain, through heat, through exhaustion, because alternative to productivity isn't reduced income, but direct threat to survival. Returning to the settlement midday, you encounter pregnant women continuing normal work duties until delivery becomes imminent. No maternity leave, no activity restrictions, no special accommodations beyond what community members might voluntarily provide. Pregnancy in the biblical world isn't medicalized condition, but normal state requiring continued contribution, despite physical challenges. Women work through morning sickness, through back pain, through the exhaustion accompanying fetal development, because communities cannot afford productivity loss over conditions affecting half the adult population regularly throughout their fertile years. This reality illuminates biblical narratives where pregnant women undertake journeys, engage in physical labor, or participate in normal activities modern prenatal care would discourage. Mary traveling late in pregnancy to Bethlehem wasn't exceptional behavior, but typical necessity in societies where survival required continued function regardless of physical condition. Elizabeth continuing household management through unexpected late life pregnancy represented normal expectation rather than exceptional devotion. The afternoon brings new physical challenges as weather shifts suddenly. Dark clouds gather, wind increases, temperature drops precipitously. No weather forecasting services provided warning. No permanent structures offer reliable shelter. No waterproof materials protect bodies and essential belongings. Storm preparation happens with urgent efficiency, bringing livestock under whatever protection exists, securing food stores against water damage, collecting essential tools and items that cannot be replaced if washed away or destroyed. The storm itself demonstrates weather's direct impact on biblical bodies in ways modern climate control has largely eliminated. Rain finds every opening in roughly constructed shelters, creating immediate discomfort without dry clothing options or efficient heating systems to restore warmth. Lightning strikes nearby. Thunder resonates physically in your chest. Wind threatens structural integrity of buildings constructed without engineering standards or reinforced materials. Biblical descriptions of storms as divine communication make visceral sense in environments where weather represents not inconvenience, but direct existential threat beyond human control or prediction. Huddled with others in marginally effective shelter, conversations naturally address meaning within apparent weather chaos. Without meteorological understanding, patterns must be interpreted through available frameworks, primarily religious systems connecting natural phenomena with divine intention. This isn't ignorant superstition, but necessary meaning, making within information limitations. Biblical weather theology, with its connections between human behavior and natural consequences, represents rational attempt to establish causality between observable phenomena, even without scientific mechanisms connecting them. As the storm passes, leaving destruction requiring immediate response, you witness another dimension of physical challenge, the necessity of repairing environmental damage without specialized equipment, without standardized materials, without outside assistance. Modern disaster responses, with their professional teams, their heavy machinery, their insurance compensation, their government aid, have no parallel in biblical contexts. Communities must absorb loss, redirect already insufficient resources to reconstruction, and continue meeting basic survival needs simultaneously. This experience illuminates biblical disaster narratives. Floods, famines, plagues aren't distant events affecting anonymous others, but immediate community experiences requiring theological interpretation alongside practical response. Their prominence in biblical texts reflects their frequency in actual experience rather than literary emphasis on exceptional circumstances. The biblical world lived perpetually on edge of potential disaster that modern systems have reduced in both frequency and impact through prediction, prevention, and response capabilities unavailable to ancient communities. As reconstruction efforts continue through afternoon, you engage with individuals revealing another dimension of biblical physical reality, chronic pain as universal experience, rather than medical condition requiring intervention. People work through back injuries, through joint inflammation, through headaches, through digestive disturbances that modern individuals would consider sufficient justification for activity limitation or medication. Pain in the biblical world isn't exception but baseline condition, acknowledged but rarely accommodated because survival doesn't permit productivity cessation for discomfort management. This context transforms understanding of biblical healing narratives. When people sought healing from Jesus or other figures believed to possess supernatural power, they weren't pursuing unnecessary medical intervention for minor discomfort, but desperate relief from conditions making survival, necessary function impossible. Their faith wasn't abstract theological position, but concrete hope that divine intervention might succeed where human capacity had definitively failed. Healing represented not convenience but restoration to productive community participation when all other options were exhausted. Evening brings physical exhaustion beyond anything your modern body typically experiences. Every muscle group has engaged in sustained exertion without mechanical assistance. Your hands bear blisters and small cuts from tools designed for function rather than comfort. Your feet throb from uneven terrain navigated without supportive footwear. Your skin burns from sun and wind exposure without protective products. Your shoulders ache from carrying water, from lifting materials, from pulling against natural resistance throughout the day. Yet around you, biblical people continue evening activities without the collapse your body craves. Their physical conditioning reflects lifelong adaptation to demands that would incapacitate modern individuals accustomed to mechanical and technological mediation between intention and physical outcome. Their capacity isn't superior genetic endowment, but accumulated adaptation through consistent demand beginning in earliest childhood and continuing without interruption throughout lifetime. This observation illuminates biblical references to strength, to endurance, to labor with different significance. Physical capacity, in biblical contexts, represented fundamental survival advantage rather than aesthetic preference or athletic achievement. Samson's strength, David's physical prowess, Jael's ability to drive a tent peg weren't exceptional abilities, but extreme expressions of qualities every community member developed through necessity rather than choice. Biblical admiration for physical capability reflects its direct correlation with survival outcomes, rather than cultural preference for particular body types or abilities. As evening meal preparation begins, relationships between biblical individuals emerge with greater clarity. Without privacy creating emotional distance, without technology enabling remote communication, without mobility separating families across geographic distance, biblical relationships develop intensity and interdependence modern connections rarely achieve. The people preparing food together have known each other from birth, have witnessed each other's most intimate moments, have depended on each other through crises that threatened collective survival. You observe subtle communication patterns requiring no verbalization, hands working in coordinated sequence without direction, bodies moving in practiced choreography, avoiding collision in limited space, resources allocated through facial expressions and minimal gestures rather than explicit discussion. These aren't exceptional examples of interpersonal attunement, but normal adaptations in communities where survival depends on efficient coordination without communication redundancy. The family relationships particularly demonstrate differences from modern nuclear family structures. Children interact with numerous adult authority figures besides biological parents. Older siblings assume quasi-parental responsibility for younger ones. Grandparents provide not occasional support, but continuous integrated care within multi-generational households. Biblical family references to fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters encompass relationship categories rather than exclusively biological connections, reflecting communities organized around function rather than genetic relationship exclusively. Marriage within this context operates on fundamentally different premises than modern romantic partnerships. A nearby couple demonstrates subtle interaction patterns, revealing deeper structural purpose, their connection centered on complementary survival functions rather than emotional fulfillment or personal development. Their communication focuses primarily on task coordination, resource allocation, and collective welfare rather than emotional exchange or affirmation of mutual feelings. This doesn't mean affection absence, but priority difference. Survival cooperation necessarily precedes emotional satisfaction when resources remain perpetually insufficient for basic needs. This framework illuminates biblical marriage instructions, often considered problematic from modern perspectives. Directives about male authority, female submission, specific gender-based responsibilities reflect practical adaptations to survival environments requiring clear decision hierarchies and efficient division of labor rather than philosophical statements about inherent worth or abstract capacity. Without romanticizing inherently limited options, you recognize how gender-differentiated roles provided functional structure, ensuring community survival through complementary contribution, rather than competition for identical social positions. As the communal meal begins, another relationship dimension emerges through seating arrangements and serving order reflecting complex status distinctions. Biblical communities weren't egalitarian, but strictly hierarchical, with position determined through multiple intersecting factors: age, gender, family connection, economic capacity, religious role, demonstrated wisdom. These weren't arbitrary discriminations, but organizing principles, ensuring predictable social interactions, essential for community function when survival margins remained perpetually narrow. The meal itself facilitates relationship networks through distinct interaction patterns. Information exchanges between women create parallel communication systems alongside more visible male-dominated discussions. Children absorb cultural values through observation and occasional correction rather than direct instruction. Elders receive deference reflecting their survival accomplishment and accumulated wisdom. Individuals with specialized knowledge or skills receive acknowledgement proportional to their community contribution, rather than abstract credentials or theoretical expertise. After eating, conversation shifts towards storytelling with specific focus on biblical characters as relatable individuals rather than remote spiritual archetypes. Abraham's fear leading to deception about Sarah being his sister, Jacob's complicated family dynamics from multiple wives, David's passionate errors and subsequent consequences. These aren't presented as distant historical events, but immediately relevant examples containing practical wisdom applicable to present challenges. Biblical figures emerge not as perfect moral exemplars, but as complex individuals navigating survival challenges through combinations of wisdom, error, faith, and failure that community members recognize in themselves. This approach transforms biblical narrative understanding fundamentally. Stories modern readers often interpret as moral instruction, as theological statement, or as historical documentation functioned originally as multidimensional cultural transmission vehicles, providing entertainment, ethical guidance, practical wisdom, identity formation, and religious frameworks simultaneously. Their characters weren't distant spiritual heroes, but recognizable types, embodying both potential and limitation familiar to audiences intimately acquainted with similar challenges. As evening deepens, relationship bonds strengthen through shared music voices combining in patterns passed through generations without written notation. No performers separate from audience, but communal participation, creating collective experience, rather than entertainment consumption. Biblical references to singing, to psalms, to instruments reflect these moments where community creates beauty within hardship, where coordination transcends practical necessity into shared expression, binding individuals together through synchronized breath and voice. The music shifts gradually toward lament, acknowledging loss, expressing grief, naming hardships without minimization or forced positivity. This isn't emotional indulgence, but necessary psychological processing of difficult realities that cannot be changed, but must be integrated into continuing function. Biblical texts contain more laments than any other psalm category, not from pessimistic worldview, but from realistic assessment of human vulnerability, requiring communal acknowledgement rather than denial or dismissal. As night settles fully, relationship patterns shift toward protective configurations. Sleeping arrangements ensure vulnerable community members, the very young, the elderly, the ill, occupy central positions surrounded by those capable of defensive response. Watch rotations establish clear responsibility sequence rather than leaving security to chance or individual initiative. These aren't merely practical arrangements, but physical expressions of core biblical values, community responsibility for vulnerable members, sacrificial prioritization of collective welfare over individual comfort, practical implementation of ethical principles through tangible action rather than abstract adherence. Your own place within these arrangements has shifted subtly since arrival. Initially positioned as vulnerable outsider requiring protection despite contributing little, you now occupy more integrated position, reflecting growing capacity to participate in essential tasks, to understand community communication patterns, to anticipate needs without explicit direction. This progression reflects biblical community incorporation patterns, where belonging develops through demonstrated function rather than formal acceptance procedures or abstract rights allocation. The darkness brings conversation toward foundational relationship questions, human connection with divine reality beyond physical limitation and mortality. Without distraction, without alternative frameworks, biblical night creates space where existential questions emerge naturally. The discussion moves between practical concerns about tomorrow's tasks and deeper exploration of meaning beyond immediate survival necessities. This isn't compartmentalized spiritual time, but integrated meaning, making woven through practical reality without artificial separation. You listen as individuals share experiences they interpret as divine communication, dreams conveying warnings about potential dangers, intuitive knowledge preserving life despite incomplete information, seemingly coincidental circumstances resulting in essential resource provision when community need exceeded human capacity to provide. These aren't presented as supernatural violations of natural law, but as recognized patterns within larger reality framework where visible and invisible causality operate simultaneously through consistent principles rather than occasional intervention. This perspective illuminates biblical miracle accounts differently, not as suspension of natural law for arbitrary demonstration purposes, but as moments where divine reality, normally operating behind observable phenomena, becomes temporarily visible through actions conforming perfectly to community need. Biblical authors don't express surprise that miracles occur, but that they occur in particular ways at particular moments, revealing divine character and intention through specific provision patterns, rather than generic power demonstration. As fatigue claims more community members, conversations quiet to essential communication only. Relationships continue expressing through physical proximity, through subtle adjustments ensuring collective comfort within limited resources, through watchfulness protecting vulnerability that sleep creates. Biblical community doesn't pause during unconsciousness, but continues functioning through rotating responsibility, ensuring continuous protection against threats that never sleep. Your own consciousness begins fragmenting towards sleep, awareness moving between physical sensation, the hard ground beneath inadequate padding, the night air cooling exposed skin, the sounds of breathing bodies nearby, and deeper recognition of relationship reality underlying biblical texts. These weren't documents produced by isolated authors expressing individual spiritual insight, but community wisdom distilled through generations of survival experience, capturing essential patterns, ensuring continued existence within hostile environments where individual capacity invariably proved insufficient without collective contribution. The biblical world doesn't separate relationship categories into distinct domains as modern society does, dividing professional, personal, religious, and familial connections into different interaction patterns with different governing principles. Here, relationships maintain consistent patterns across contexts because their fundamental purpose, ensuring collective survival through coordinated contribution, remains constant regardless of specific activity or setting. Biblical ethics, with their emphasis on reciprocal obligation, on communal responsibility, on consistent character across contexts, reflect this integrated relationship reality, where trustworthiness determines survival outcomes directly rather than abstract moral worth. As consciousness fades completely, final insight forms with perfect clarity. Biblical texts emerged from communities where relationship functioned as primary survival technology, without material abundance creating independence, without professional specialization enabling isolation, without communication technology permitting distance. Biblical people survived exclusively through relationship networks, ensuring resource sharing, knowledge transmission, labor coordination, protection provision, and meaning creation necessary for continued existence under conditions where individual capacity reached limitation almost immediately. This fundamental reality explains why relationship dominates biblical concern, why covenant rather than contract establishes interaction parameters, why community rather than individual represents primary identity unit, why character rather than achievement determines worth assessment, why obligation rather than preference governs behavior expectation. These weren't arbitrary cultural distinctions, but essential adaptations to environments where survival depended entirely on relationship quality and reliability rather than individual capacity or resource accumulation. Sleep claims you finally, your body surrendering to physical necessity despite intellectual fascination with these insights. The biblical world continues functioning around you, breath rising and falling in darkness, bodies adjusting position without full wakefulness, watchful guardians maintaining protective vigilance while others rest. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new insights, new experiences of biblical reality stripped of modern assumptions. But tonight, surrounded by sleeping bodies whose very survival depends on relationships' modern independence, has rendered optional rather than essential, you understand something fundamental about texts that emerged from this reality, their persistent emphasis on human connection as primary divine concern reflects original survival context, where relationship wasn't philosophical preference but existential necessity. Your immersion in the biblical world continues as dawn breaks, revealing a day unlike those preceding it. A palpable excitement ripples through the community, preparations underway for something beyond routine daily tasks. You've awakened during a significant religious festival, perhaps Passover, Sukkot, or another celebration marking the intersection of agricultural cycles with spiritual commemoration. This timing provides unique opportunity to witness biblical events not as abstract religious history, but as lived experience shaping communal identity and individual meaning. The settlement transforms visibly. Spaces normally devoted to practical tasks now accommodate ritual preparations. People wear garments reserved for special occasions, still modest by modern standards, but incorporating subtle embellishments, revealing care beyond mere function. Even faces appear different, anticipation tempering the usual watchfulness against imminent threat, celebration creating temporary respite from survival's constant demands. Biblical festivals weren't merely religious obligations, but essential psychological renewal, communal reaffirmation, and identity reinforcement within environments offering little respite from physical hardship. You join a family preparing for participation, experiencing firsthand how biblical events incorporated practical, social, and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. Food preparation intensifies beyond daily needs, quantities increase, special items appear, cooking techniques normally reserved for significant occasions come into practice. This isn't mere celebration, but meaningful remembrance through sensory experience. Physical participation in cultural continuity connecting present hardship with historical significance and future hope. The preparations include young children learning ritual responsibilities appropriate to their ages. No separate children's programming exists. They participate directly in adult religious practices, absorbing cultural meaning through embodied experience rather than abstract explanation. Biblical events weren't age-segregated, but communally integrated, each generation fulfilling specific roles, ensuring tradition transmission, while incorporating new participants into established patterns, linking individual identity with collective history. Moving toward festival gathering, you encounter pilgrims arrived from surrounding areas, their presence transforming the settlement's normal population density and social dynamics. Languages mix as regional variations, create momentary comprehension challenges, yet shared ritual knowledge transcends linguistic difference. This experience illuminates biblical accounts of festival pilgrimage, Jerusalem's population swelling during major celebrations, diverse groups temporarily united through shared practice despite regional, tribal, or political divisions complicating everyday interactions. The gathering itself presents biblical events in multidimensional reality beyond textual description. Sensory elements overwhelm individual components. The smell of sacrificial offerings, the sound of ritual recitation spoken by hundreds simultaneously, the visual impact of ceremonial movements performed collectively, the physical sensation of bodies pressed together in shared space, the taste of symbolic foods consumed with specific intention. Biblical worship wasn't primarily intellectual assent to theological proposition, but full-body participation in commemorative reenactment, making abstract history tangible through sensory experience. You observe ritual leadership with new understanding of biblical priesthood and religious authority. Those directing proceedings aren't separate professional class distinct from community, but specialized function within integrated social structure. Their authority derives from demonstrated knowledge, from ceremonial lineage, from community recognition, rather than institutional certification or abstract theological expertise. They wear distinctive garments not as status symbols, but functional indicators, making their role visible within large gatherings where coordination requires clear visual identification. The rituals themselves reveal how biblical events balanced prescribed structure with embodied participation. Certain elements follow exact patterns preserved through generations, words spoken precisely as tradition dictates, movements performed according to established sequence. Yet within this framework, individual experience varies widely, some participants weeping openly, others maintaining solemn composure, children watching with varying degrees of comprehension, elderly members possibly experiencing their final participation in cycles they've witnessed dozens of times previously. Biblical religion accommodated this diversity without requiring uniform emotional response or identical spiritual understanding. As ceremonial aspects conclude, celebration transforms toward communal feasting, families gathering in groups, food shared according to prescribed patterns, balancing ceremonial requirements with practical necessity. Conversation flows between ordinary topics and deeper reflection on the event's significance. No artificial separation between sacred and secular concerns. Biblical events integrated these dimensions by design, creating space where agricultural cycles, historical commemoration, theological meaning, and community reinforcement converged through shared physical experience. You're invited to join a family's feast. Their inclusion of an outsider reflecting biblical hospitality principles, not as abstract virtue, but practical ethic, ensuring no one remains isolated during communal celebration. The meal differs from everyday fare not merely in quantity, but composition. Elements carrying specific symbolic significance appear. Serving order follows meaningful pattern. Certain combinations are either required or prohibited according to festival tradition. These aren't arbitrary restrictions, but embodied theology, making abstract meaning physically tangible through consumption practices, distinguishing sacred occasion from ordinary sustenance. Conversation during the meal reveals how biblical events shaped collective identity beyond ceremonial participation. Family members recount previous celebrations, speculate about future ones, connect present experience with ancestral stories. Children ask questions about ritual elements, receiving explanations, balancing accessible language with theological accuracy. This pattern mirrors biblical instruction passages, explicitly directing ceremonial explanation to younger generations. When your children ask you, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" then tell them, recognizing that ritual without understanding becomes empty performance rather than meaningful participation. As afternoon progresses, the celebration shifts toward informal social gathering. Music emerges spontaneously. Physical games develop in open spaces. Storytelling circles form around particularly skilled narrators. These activities aren't secular additions to religious observance, but integrated components of biblical events, recognizing human need for communal reinforcement through shared pleasure alongside ceremonial solemnity. Biblical celebrations accommodated full humanity rather than artificially elevating spiritual elements above embodied experience. You witness a storyteller gathering particular attention, his narrative recognizable as biblical account you've encountered textually, but transformed through performance into multidimensional experience. He doesn't merely recite facts, but embodies characters through voice modulation, facial expression, and physical gesture. Audience members respond actively, completing familiar phrases, responding to rhetorical questions, murmuring approval at skillfully delivered passages. This isn't passive reception, but collaborative meaning making. Community collectively engaging with foundational narrative through performer temporarily embodying tradition for shared reconsideration and renewed application. The story itself, perhaps Exodus liberation, Abraham's journey, David's kingship, or another foundational biblical narrative emerges with contextual richness absent from textual encounter alone. Geographic references connect with listeners' actual travel experience in the region. Agricultural metaphors link directly with communities' seasonal patterns. Political dimensions resonate with present imperial realities. Characters' motivations appear comprehensible within recognizable social frameworks, rather than requiring historical reconstruction. Biblical narratives originated in similar settings, addressing audiences who experience these connections implicitly rather than requiring scholarly mediation to bridge contextual gaps modern readers face. As the storyteller reaches narrative climax, you observe powerful emotional response from listeners, despite their familiarity with the account. This isn't information reception, but identity reinforcement, community collectively experiencing formative history as present reality rather than distant past. Biblical events fundamentally shaped consciousness through this cyclical reenactment, each repetition layering new meaning onto established pattern, allowing individual circumstances to find reflection within ancestral experience, connecting personal challenges with collective meaning frameworks developed through generations of similar application. The celebration continues as daylight begins fading, lanterns appearing to extend communal interaction beyond natural illumination, a significant resource expenditure, revealing the event's importance within community prioritization. Night festivals carried particular significance in biblical context, their darkness creating liminality between ordinary experience and transcendent possibility. Without electric lighting flattening distinction between day and night, darkness itself became meaningful participant in religious experience rather than mere absence requiring technological correction. Moving through the celebration, you encounter various biblical event components modern religious practice often omits or sanitizes. Physical expressions of spiritual experience manifest openly, some participants weeping uncontrollably, others entering trance, like states through rhythmic movement or breathing patterns, still others engaging in ecstatic utterance or prophetic declaration. These weren't marginal extremes but recognized manifestations along spiritual experience continuum, community accommodating diverse expression without requiring uniformity or imposing arbitrary limitations on embodied response to divine encounter. A dispute erupts between celebration participants, theological disagreement escalating toward physical confrontation before community intervention redirects energy. This is an aberration but realistic aspect of biblical events, frequently sanitized in retrospective idealization. Sacred texts record similar disruptions across religious history, temple commerce conflicts, communion distribution disputes, prophetic confrontations with institutional leadership. Biblical events weren't immune from human limitation, but provided structured container for negotiating inevitable conflict within parameters preventing community dissolution, despite significant internal disagreement. As celebration gradually transitions toward conclusion, you witness closing rituals marking boundary between sacred occasion and ordinary time resumption. These aren't merely ceremonial formalities, but psychological necessities, helping participants reorient toward everyday responsibilities after intense communal experience. Biblical events recognize need for transition rather than expecting immediate shift between celebratory immersion and routine productivity, closing blessings, final shared meals. Gradual dispersal rather than abrupt termination allowed psychological integration of festival experience within continuing life rhythm. With formal aspects concluded, you observe how biblical events extended beyond official parameters through continuing discussion among community members, returning to ordinary settings. Conversations analyze particular ritual elements, evaluate leadership effectiveness, connect ceremonial themes with immediate community challenges. This wasn't irreverent criticism, but essential adaptation process, community collectively determining how ancestral tradition should address present circumstances without sacrificing core continuity. Biblical religion survived through this balance between preservation and application, between received tradition and present necessity, between historical foundation and contemporary relevance. As night fully encompasses the settlement, quieter reflection replaces celebratory expression. You join a small group gathered around dying fire, their conversation exploring festival significance beyond ceremonial participation. their questions penetrate surface experience, asking how divine promises manifest within current hardship, how ancestral covenant applies to present threats, how religious identity sustains itself through hostile environments, threatening cultural dissolution. These weren't abstract theological speculations, but urgent practical concerns requiring workable answers within settings where survival remained perpetually uncertain. The conversation reveals sophisticated theological engagement belying modern assumptions about biblical simplicity. Participants demonstrate nuanced understanding of metaphorical language, of narrative function, of ethical complexity beyond literal textual application. Without academic credentials or institutional position, they engage profound religious questions through practical wisdom framework developed within survival context, rather than theoretical abstraction. Biblical theology emerged from similar conversations, ordinary people confronting extraordinary questions through collective wisdom, rather than isolated scholarly reflection separated from immediate application necessity. As group gradually disbands, individuals returning to sleeping areas, you find yourself contemplating broader significance of biblical events beyond specific religious traditions. These gatherings served essential functions, transcending particular theological content, creating social cohesion through shared experience, establishing temporal rhythm within otherwise undifferentiated survival struggle, connecting individual meaning with collective identity, providing psychological renewal through ceremonial interruption of constant vigilance against threat. Biblical events weren't luxury additions to basic existence, but essential components of survival strategy, addressing needs beyond immediate physical sustenance. The settlement quiets as physical exhaustion claims even the most energetic celebration participants. Ordinary sleeping arrangements resume. Those subtle differences reflect festival aftermath, slightly relaxed vigilance, marginally increased willingness to accommodate strangers, temporarily reduced social barriers between normally separated groups. Biblical events created brief liminality, allowing community reconfiguration, relationship repair, status adjustment, and conflict resolution that rigid everyday structures might otherwise prevent. Their cyclical recurrence provided essential adaptation mechanism, ensuring social flexibility within otherwise conservative survival systems. Your own body registers intense fatigue beyond normal day's exertion. Celebration participation demanded physical investment modern religious experience rarely requires. Hours standing during ceremonies, movement through dense crowds without personal space expectations, sensory processing without environmental controls moderating stimulation levels, emotional engagement without psychological distance. Biblical worship engaged entire embodied personhood rather than primarily cognitive or affective dimensions isolated from physical experience. Sleep approaches with unusual speed, your consciousness already fragmenting when head touches improvised pillow. Around you, the biblical world continues its necessary routines. Someone maintains watchfulness, while others rest. Cooking fires receive banking to preserve embers. Until morning, water vessels sit prepared for dawn requirements. Festival participation temporarily transcended survival necessities, but didn't eliminate them. Biblical events provided meaningful interruption, rather than permanent escape from environmental realities, shaping everyday existence. As awareness fades toward dreamscape, insights crystallize about biblical events beyond specific religious content. Modern society segregates experience into distinct categories, work separate from leisure, religious practice separate from ordinary activity, entertainment separate from education, individual development separate from community participation. Biblical events integrated these artificially separated dimensions, creating holistic experience addressing simultaneous needs through unified participation rather than compartmentalized scheduling requiring context. switching between fundamentally different activity modes. This integration extended to identity formation, biblical events simultaneously addressing individual meaning and collective belonging through participation structures accommodating both dimensions without requiring their separation. Modern identity construction often positions these as competing priorities: personal authenticity versus group conformity, individual expression versus communal expectation. Biblical events provided framework where these apparent opposites functioned as complementary dimensions of integrated humanity, each requiring the other for complete expression, rather than existing in zero-sum competition for limited authenticity resources. Your consciousness continues dissolving toward complete rest. Final observations forming about biblical events: environmental adaptation, their cyclical nature aligned with agricultural seasons, cosmic patterns, and historical commemoration created resilient meaning system capable of withstanding individual disappointment, specific harvest failure, or particular historical disaster without collapsing entirely. By distributing significance across multiple reference points, biblical religion developed sustainability beyond specific outcome vulnerability, allowing meaning preservation despite inevitable specific failures within uncertain survival environments. This insight illuminates biblical persistence across centuries of disruption, displacement, and destruction that might reasonably have eliminated less adaptable meaning systems. The integration of natural cycles, historical commemoration, ethical framework, and future anticipation created redundant significance, ensuring preservation through diverse challenges rather than depending on singular foundation vulnerable to specific threat. Biblical events weren't merely religious ceremonies, but complex adaptive systems, ensuring cultural survival through meaning preservation when physical continuity faced persistent uncertainty. As sleep claims final awareness, your immersion in biblical reality approaches completion. The experience has transformed abstract knowledge into embodied understanding, theoretical familiarity into visceral recognition of environmental conditions shaping Scripture's emergence and continuing resonance. The biblical world isn't distant historical curiosity, but fundamental human experience pattern temporarily obscured by technological mediation rather than permanently transcended through progress narrative. Its insights, adaptations, and wisdom remain relevant precisely because they address core human needs and limitations that persist despite surface transformation through technological development. The settlement sleeps around you, bodies rising and falling with breath rhythms, unchanged across millennia of human experience. Tomorrow will bring return to ordinary patterns, festival energy gradually dispersing into routine necessity, celebration memories integrating with everyday meaning construction. But something has fundamentally shifted through participation. Abstract biblical knowledge has transformed into embodied understanding, theoretical appreciation into experiential recognition. The texts emerging from this world can never again appear as distant religious documents, but remain permanently illuminated through direct encounter with their originating context. Your consciousness fades completely, sleep claiming perception as biblical reality continues functioning, breath rising and falling, hearts beating with ancient rhythm, bodies temporarily vulnerable, yet collectively secured through community watchfulness. Your modern identity hasn't disappeared, but expanded through direct encounter with fundamental patterns shaping human experience across temporal boundaries, across technological development, across cultural evolution. The biblical world hasn't replaced contemporary understanding, but deepened it through connection with ancestral wisdom addressing perennial human needs beyond specific historical manifestation. And in this integration of ancient and modern, of individual and collective, of physical and spiritual, of survival necessity and transcendent meaning, you find perfect rest, not as escape from reality, but as complete immersion within it, not as temporary distraction, but as fundamental connection with human experience transcending artificial categorization. The biblical world offers sleep not through detachment from harshness, but through acceptance of limitation within meaning framework, transcending specific circumstance without denying its reality. In this authentic rest, consciousness releases completely, joining biblical sleepers across millennia in universal pattern, uniting humanity beyond temporal, geographical, technological, or cultural separation. And in this unity, sleep deepens toward genuine restoration, not merely physical recovery, but holistic renewal, connecting individual experience with collective wisdom, present circumstance with ancestral insight, momentary challenge with enduring meaning. The biblical world continues its necessary rhythms as your awareness dissolves completely into sleep's embrace. Tomorrow remains uncertain yet addressed through patterns, proven resilient across centuries of similar uncertainty. This isn't naive optimism but tested adaptation, not wishful thinking but practical wisdom, refined through generations of survival experience within environments where nothing could be taken for granted, but meaning itself could be preserved through intentional commemoration, collective participation, and individual integration within frameworks transcending momentary circumstance. And in this fundamental biblical insight that meaning transcends circumstance, without denying its reality, sleep claims you completely, offering rest through acceptance rather than escape, through integration rather than denial, through connection rather than isolation. The biblical world has offered its most essential gift, perspective balancing clear-eyed recognition of limitation with unflinching affirmation of significance beyond immediate experience. And in this balance, consciousness releases completely into genuine restoration beyond mere unconsciousness, into sleep that renews rather than merely interrupts, into rest that prepares rather than merely suspends.